All right, welcome everyone to this REL Pacific webinar on effective data use to support English learner students, our second of two webinars on this topic. My name is Roger Fiedler and I'll be the MC for today's session. I'm the Communications Director at McREL International, which administers the REL Pacific program on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. I'll tell you more about the REL program and today's topic in just a moment, but first, a couple of quick housekeeping reminders for today's session. First off, we're asking all participants to please leave your microphones and phone lines muted to keep our audio as clear as possible. We do want our session today to be engaging and interactive, however, so please use the chat box to share your questions and thoughts throughout the session. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and our presenters will pause from time to time to answer questions that have come up. And we'll also take some time at the end of the session to address any additional questions that come up. To kick the chat off and to give it a try, please give it a try now, letting us know where you're joining us from and if there's a particular ELL data or assessment issue that you're hoping to learn more about during today's session. In addition to interacting with all of you in the chat, we've also scheduled a breakout room discussion a little later on in the program where you'll have a chance to speak directly with some of our REL Pacific representatives and partner organizations about ELL data and assessments. Our program today is scheduled for about an hour to an hour and a half in duration, depending on how many questions we get and the depth of conversation that we end up having in the breakout rooms. If you are not familiar with REL Pacific or the REL program in general, the regional education laboratories are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. So in each of their assigned regions, the 10 RELs collaborate with their local school districts, state departments of education, policymakers, and other education stakeholders to help them all put research into action. The RELs conduct applied research and they provide trainings to educators and system leaders, all with the mission of supporting a more evidence-based education system and using research in ways that improve academic outcomes for students. And today's webinar is sponsored by REL Pacific. The REL Pacific serves educators and school systems that are spread across 5 million square miles, including the state of Hawaii, the U.S. territories of American Samoa, Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the island nations of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. Now, our work in the region with stakeholders from each of these jurisdictions focuses on 5 high priority areas, and they are college and career readiness and success, professional learning, language and literacy, social emotional learning, and data use and readiness. And several of these topic areas are what lead us to today's webinar, where we will be exploring and discussing considerations for English learner students in an assessment system. And while we know that this topic is of high priority in the Pacific region, we know it's also of high interest nationally, and we have participants today joining us from not just specific jurisdictions, but also from all across the United States, from a variety of roles in schools and in school districts, state departments, service agencies, universities, and more. I mentioned earlier that this was the second of a 2-part series, so if you missed the first webinar, which was held a few weeks ago, please check the REL Pacific website where we will be posting the recording of that session. And then following today's session, the recording from today will also be posted there. Our presenters today are Dr. Molly Faulkner-Bond and Elizabeth Burr. Dr. Faulkner-Bond is passionate about all things related to English learner instruction, policy, and assessment. In her current role at WestEd, she collaborates with educators, researchers, and communities to strengthen the field of education research, increase the use and utility of research results, and improve educational outcomes for linguistically and culturally diverse learners. Prior to joining WestEd, Dr. Faulkner-Bond was a grant program officer at the Institute of Education Sciences, where she provided technical assistance to the recipients of research grants that were focused on improving educational opportunities and outcomes for English learner students. And Elizabeth Burr is a senior research associate who's been at WestEd for 14 years. And she has worked in education research and policy for more than 2 decades, focusing on English learner students, including those with disabilities, and early education issues. She was a lead author of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. Before I hand things over to Elizabeth and Molly, let's take a moment to review our learning objectives for today's session. We'll be reviewing data elements that are related to English learner students' performance. We'll also be discussing considerations around the validity of and the best practices for assessing English learner students and using that data for decision making. And lastly, we'll spend some time learning how to effectively present and communicate data about English learner students with stakeholders. So those are the session objectives for today. And with that, I'm going to now hand things over to Elizabeth, who will briefly review some of the major learnings and themes that came up during the first session that we held, the first webinar. And if we have participants who are with us today who attended that first webinar, ask for some reflections from participants who attended them. So Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Roger. Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. You did not have to attend the first webinar to benefit from today's presentation, but I did want to give you a brief recap. So the first webinar was titled Using Accountability Data to Improve Policies and Practices for English Learner Students. And it was led by our West Ed colleague, Eric Crane, who is with us today. And Eric covered the following topics: important elements of data-driven decision-making, research-based practices in data use, and the concept of a cycle of accountability system and its development, and data for progress monitoring of English learner students. I really encourage you to listen to the webinar archive, which, as Roger mentioned, will be available and sent out to you in the coming weeks, along with the archive for this webinar. And after Eric's presentation, participants went into breakout rooms to discuss data and communication needs related to the cycle of accountability system development. And they were asked questions like, what are we interested in learning from our data and toward what end? And what indicators do we include or want to include in our accountability system, and which data are available? And who within our agency needs to be in the accountability discussion, and how do we inform and engage our colleagues? So in these rich discussions, a couple themes emerged. Indeed, there were gaps in the information available and the information needed, such as states and districts were not able to disaggregate English learner subgroups by type, including newcomers, long-term English language learners, students with limited or interrupted formal education, and English learners with disabilities. And relatedly, information was lacking to support students receiving multiple services, such as English learners with disabilities. There also was no disaggregation of English learner students by home language. And this is an issue because achievement varies across English learner groups, as we know. And we also know that Spanish speakers themselves are not a monolithic population. They have various indigenous languages and different countries of origin. So there are there are barriers to getting the fine-grained information that we need. There were also challenges related to data collection. In addition to a lack of familiarity with English learner data within departments, a compliance mindset driven more by checking boxes trumped a continuous improvement mindset. And data literacy is a need to become more of a consumer of data than a recipient of them. And lastly, participants noted a greater reliance on test data for policy decisions without including school or family data. Any of these issues resonate with you, you are in the right place. My wonderful colleague Molly is going to address and build upon these topics. So over to you, Molly.
All right, thanks so much. And thank you all for being here. I am going to hopefully take over the slides. Let's see. Okay. So we're going to spend a few minutes here at the beginning just trying to remind ourselves of the context for English learner education and assessment. So I always feel like it's really helpful when we start talking about data and data use and data interpretation for English learners to just remind ourselves why we assess these students, what we aim to accomplish in terms of educating these students, and really keep that in our minds as we then start to think about what data we need and how we're going to interpret that data and use it. So let's see. All right. So I always like to start by just reminding us of the policy context. As you can see from the tiny font on this slide, I'm not expecting you to read every word here. I'm sure you will get the slides afterwards. And so this will be available if you do want to read it afterwards. But I do think it's important to remind ourselves that English learner education is governed by more than just the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So some of the other major policies that are relevant for consideration are listed here. So we have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. We have the Lau v. Nichols Supreme Court decision from 1974. We have the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, whose name, as it suggests, is really focused on ensuring that English learners or any students don't miss out on the same opportunities as other students solely because of their home language, their race, their color, their sex. And then we also have the two most recent reauthorizations of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So in 2002, it was reauthorized as No Child Left Behind, and Title III of that act focused on ensuring that limited English proficient children, as they were then called, develop high levels of academic attainment in English and also meet challenging state academic content standards. And then that same similar mission was reiterated in the 2015 reauthorization as the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is where we are now. So again, we're not going to go too much into the weeds here. Hopefully this is a review for many of you. But I think the three themes that I really just want to draw out to sort of undergird the rest of our discussion are the ones you see on this slide here. So across these different laws, a big theme that you'll see is ensuring that English learners have access to the same educational opportunities that all students have. So we want to make sure that states or districts are not denying educational opportunities on the basis of race, color, sex, or national origin, where language has been ruled to be a proxy for national origin. And that where any of those characteristics might serve as a barrier, that districts are taking active steps to overcome those barriers and make sure that students can participate equally. A second theme is ensuring that English learners are mastering challenging academic content, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is explicit about ensuring it's the same challenging academic content that all students are being asked to master. And then as a third theme, that we do want these students ultimately to master English and exit the English learner subgroup and the protections that it provides. So we can think of these as just sort of three major buckets of goals that we have for these students. And so as we start to think more about data and assessment score information for these students, I think it's just helpful to kind of keep going back to these goals in terms of the policy context. So as we start to think about data, I think that the implications of these goals that we want to keep in our minds can be translated into the key questions that you see here. So given the policy context for educating English learners, relevant questions to ask are things like, do English learners have access to the same educational opportunities as other students? Are English learners mastering the same rigorous academic content that all students are expected to master? Are they meeting rigorous performance standards? Are they developing English proficiency? And are they exiting from the English learner subgroup? So these are sort of the kinds of questions and indicators that we want to be asking ourselves. And we're going to talk in this presentation about some different data sources that you could look to try to think about the answers to these questions. And then for each of the questions, I think it's also helpful as an exercise to think about, so again, what are the exact indicators or evidence that you might need to answer this question? And certainly one theme that clearly came up in the previous webinar that I'll talk about again today is it may go beyond traditional administrative data. It may include data that you don't currently collect, but perhaps we can think about how you might collect it. You'll want to think about who or what provides the indicators and the evidence that you want. So can it all come from a test? Is it going to need to come from other sources? Who needs the answers to these questions? So if you do find that, for example, English learners are not mastering the same academic content standards, who needs to know about that so that they can change the system and ensure that English learners are mastering those contents? And which leads to the sort of the last question, how do you act on these answers and indicators and evidence? So we're going to spend a little more time today kind of digging into these kinds of questions. All right, so we'll take a moment to talk about performance data for English learner students. So I invite you, I guess two things I'll say as I keep going. First of all, if you have reactions or questions that you want to share in the chat, please feel free to go ahead and do that. I will try to keep an eye, but I also invite my other co-presenters, if you see anything particularly juicy that you want to draw to my attention, please feel free to chime in. And as we start to think about performance data, I would invite you to reflect on, I guess, what Elizabeth shared and be reflecting on sort of what data you know of that you have access to or that is available within your system, and also what you might want or need to find access to that you don't currently. And we can kind of regroup on that when I get to the end of this section, but certainly feel free to share your thoughts as I keep going in the chat. All right, so what are the key data we might want for monitoring the progress of English learner students? So I'm going to talk about, I don't know the number, but several categories of data, and we'll go through each of them in turn. So a big one that we'll start with is assessment data. So that'll be your sort of standardized summative assessments that are used for accountability. I also strongly recommend looking for information about students' learning opportunities, which hopefully is clearer why that's important based on the legal context we just reviewed. Information about students' background characteristics can be helpful for additional context, though we of course want to be careful not to overinterpret that. Non-academic factors such as health and family circumstances we'll talk about a bit. And then of course the policy context in which students are identified or are educated, which I think research is increasingly showing that that can make actually a fairly big difference in terms of what kinds of courses students have access to, what kinds of supports they have access to, and just sort of the context in which they're educated. So we'll start with assessments, which is sort of the most straightforward and probably the one that's most familiar to all of us. So the kinds of data that you might want to try to collect if you're interested in sort of monitoring the progress and the performance of English learner students in your system is going to be, again, your results from those end of year academic content assessments. So for content assessments, we do mean English language arts, mathematics, science, any other. The other assessments that you'll want to look at are going to be English language proficiency assessment results. And as I'll discuss on a later slide, I think it's really important to discuss these two kinds of, or consider these two kinds of scores together. And then any other assessments that you have within your system. So if you administer through course assessments, unit tests, benchmark assessments, that can be really helpful, particularly because we hope that students' language and content proficiency really is constantly evolving throughout the year. So the more information you can have and the more time points, the richer picture you can get of what students know and can do. As I mentioned, the second important area is learning opportunities. So this is going to help to provide, I think, some context for the scores you get from those tests and some particular types of data you might want to try and look at. Are the content course assignments that English learners have access to. So for example, are they enrolled in an English learner specific science class that is taught entirely in a sheltered context? Are they in a mainstream class with specific supports? If so, what are those supports? What do they actually entail? Certainly anything about academic interventions or program participation. So this might be, if there's any information about whether students are receiving, certainly if they're receiving services related to gifted and talented programs or students with disabilities, if you use response to intervention and you know the tier of support they're receiving, that kind of information. Another big one is the type of language instruction programs or services they're receiving. So sort of what is your system doing to help this particular student learn English? Are they enrolled in a two-way bilingual program? Do you use a pull-out model where a specialist will come and kind of take them to the back of the class and work with them one-on-one or in a small group? Do they have a dedicated class in their schedule for learning English? This can all be helpful information. And then also teacher assignments within your system generally and then specifically for English learners. So for example, do you use a co-teaching model where you might have an expert in language development teaching alongside a content expert at the same time? Do you have language specialists or English learner coordinators who are working more directly with students? How do those people interact? As you can see already in this data element, we're getting into information that may go beyond your sort of basic administrative data, though some of this is relatively more straightforward to collect than others. But as you start to look at these kinds of data elements, you might be seeing things that are the type of information you would need to think about, okay, how am I going to get that, or how could I set up a system to make sure we're collecting information on this? As with all students, it's always relevant to have student background information. Again, I want to stress that we don't want to overinterpret this, because very little of very few of the things on this list are going to be deterministic in terms of a student's capabilities or interests or abilities, but it can be useful to know just to sort of get to know the students a little bit. So certainly if you can find information about students' home language, that's great. I will circle back to the fact that Elizabeth said that was something that several systems found was not information they were collecting. I will say that's a potentially relatively easy one to add to your system. So in terms of information you could try to start to collect, that one might be relatively more straightforward. More difficult, but extremely useful, is information about students' proficiency in their home language. So can the student read in their home language? Do they mostly just use it for verbal communication? If they read, can they read academic books in their home language? And then the rest of these are the same kinds of things you would probably want to look at for any student. So their gender, their race, ethnicity, their disability status, their socioeconomic status, and then any information about sort of their attendance history or report cards. And I see a question from Kelly Kim in the chat. So she's saying, given that many states did not administer state assessments, what are some examples of other sources of assessment data that states are using to monitor EL students' progress and achievements? Yeah, so I think, it's interesting, Kelly, great question. I really feel like the lack of ELP assessment administration in the last school year was really an opportunity for a lot of states and districts to rethink what kind of information really is useful and appropriate for some of the uses that we are used to turning to our summative English language proficiency assessment. So the English language proficiency assessment can provide information about how the student was doing at the end of the year, but it doesn't necessarily give us that sort of ongoing information about language development. So in the conversations I've been having, I think some states are trying to think about how to encourage more sort of formative assessment practices and ongoing progress monitoring for English learners to get a sense of their language development through the year. I know that some states also use their sort of unit tests in terms of academic content to try to get some of that information. But I think it was an opportunity to sort of rethink, okay, so what kind of information can teachers gather, and how can we empower teachers to gather that information and interpret it? It does definitely take more effort, particularly if you're not set up to do it, but it might actually be data that are more appropriate for supporting some of the decisions we want to make for English learners throughout the year. Let's see, race, ethnicity categories for Indigenous immigrants can be an issue to collect. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question as well. I think that in general, race, ethnicity, there's also the fact that students don't always get to report their own race, ethnicity. So I can say, as someone who has been misraced, sometimes when somebody else is the person trying to guess what my ethnicity is, it can be tricky. I don't know beyond, so I think it's important. Some states do collect country of origin for students, which can be helpful, though again, you can have Indigenous populations from Central America. So just knowing that a student is from Guatemala doesn't necessarily tell you about their Indigenous background. I think one way to get around that is really just to ask about a student's culture when they come into the school, and really try to get as much information as you can from the student and their family, which can also be an opportunity to start to get to know the student's cultural and linguistic assets, which can really then help to inform instructors about how to engage that student and encourage them to contribute to their academic environment. All right, I'm going to try and keep plowing through. So we talked about some other non-academic factors, particularly after the last year. Any information that you can get about students' physical, mental, or emotional health obviously is important. I think that's something that we're sort of realizing the value of for all students after the last year. But I also I'm aware of some states and districts that really are trying to increase the amount of social emotional learning information that they're collecting. And I guess this circles back maybe to the question on Indigenous students, but I think, information about students' family circumstances, environmental factors, their education history, their behavior history, and their exposure to trauma And all of this, again, is information that you're probably not going to have, that you might not be collecting automatically in your system, but particularly if you have new students coming into your school, that's an opportunity to ask questions about these kinds of things. And all districts and states administer what's called a home language survey to new students, so they can identify which students may need to be screened for their English language proficiency. And so that intake process is an opportunity to potentially ask about these kinds of things in ways that aren't invasive and in ways that are welcoming, but then that can provide information that you can bring to bear on students' education. Yeah, and great comment from Dwayne about mobility could be included in attendance history. Yeah, and I agree, Dwayne. I think that's a really important thing, particularly because if you know where the student came from, if their mobility is within the United States, there may be opportunities to, get information from their previous district. Certainly for migrant students, I know that's a big focus, is trying to track students across systems so that their information can move with them. So yeah, I agree that that's a really important data point. All right, in addition to everything we've talked about, one final category that I think is important is this progress monitoring data. So this goes back to the idea that we want to try and move beyond just test scores or just information at one point in time. So progress monitoring information can kind of add some context and some nuance to the types of data that we've talked about on the preceding slides. And it's helpful also because, again, ideally, students' language proficiency and their content knowledge should be evolving over time. And so getting multiple measures, multiple types of measures, data from multiple sources at multiple points of time can really help to give you a richer picture of students' progress, which often is ultimately what we want to find. So again, this doesn't have to be, formal tests necessarily, and it doesn't have to be very involved, but just kind of getting in the habit of checking in with students and collecting information about where they are in terms of their ability to use language effectively in the classroom, and how that can then provide a good feedback loop to figure out what they need next in terms of instruction and stretch opportunities. And that can also give you a sense of sort of how your kids are doing. So, and the last point I'll make is just to remind folks that there are nuances also in collecting and interpreting English learner data. One of the trickiest, and this is a different kind of mobility than what Dwayne brought up in the chat, but is the mobility within and through the group. So it's a reminder that students are English learners for a temporary amount of time or a finite amount of time, and we expect them to leave the group. But so that can mean that if you compare English learners from different time points, you're going to be comparing different groups of students. So some students will have attained proficiency and exited the group, and new students may have come in who could have any level of English proficiency. So particularly if we're looking at sort of progress over time, or we're trying to get a snapshot of sort of, is our program effective for English learners, you always want to keep that in mind, because the sort of churn within the group of students coming and going can make it a little tricky to see progress, because the sort of group average often will kind of stay right where it is, because you have this sort of constant exit of the proficient students and entrance of new students. Also just important to remember, again, that English learners are not a monolith. Elizabeth said that already, but we have students who speak a variety of different languages, who come from a variety of different backgrounds. And so we want to try to really dig into that nuance and get to know our students, rather than sort of just relying on that English learner label to tell us anything. And then key subgroups, I think Elizabeth also hit on that earlier, but we want to remember, so key subgroups you might want to look at when you're thinking about that diversity are students who are labeled as long-term English learners. So these are often students who have been receiving services for 5, 6, 7 years in United States schools and have not yet become proficient. And so those students may have different needs than students who are newcomers, who are entering US schools for the first time, maybe in middle school or high school. And then also, again, we have our English learners with disabilities and speakers of specific languages. I'd love to hear if anybody is in a system that is trying to collect more social emotional learning data. If anyone has things to share there, I think that would be probably particularly interesting for a lot of us. Yes, great point, Helene, that students with limited or interrupted formal education, SLIFE, are not uniformly defined across states, so it is difficult to compare. That is a great point. Yeah, and so I think each state is kind of figuring it out by themselves, Helene, and trying to figure out, what counts as SLIFE, who counts as SLIFE, and also how do we serve these students. So yeah, there is no uniform definition, just as there isn't for long-term English learners. And I think a lot of it might have to do with sort of the context of your system. So based on the programs that we have, what kinds of foundational gaps would make us want to identify a student as SLIFE, and then how might we intervene for that student to make sure they're getting what they need. All right. Yeah, great point, Annette. It's useful to know what sequences of service students may have received. Yes, especially when they've moved across districts, but it can be difficult. Yes. All right, just to make sure we have enough time to keep going, I'm gonna push on, but I welcome you to continue to share your thoughts in the chat as we keep going. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit now about sort of best practices and valid score use. So I just spent all that time saying don't spend too much time focusing on the assessment scores, but I know that the assessment scores often are the biggest thing we have to go on and the most reliable in the sense that we know they'll come in every year, barring a pandemic year. So let's talk for a little bit about how we can make sure that we're using those scores well and interpreting them validly. So again, let's ground ourselves in the policy context. Why do we assess English learners? I would argue there are 3 reasons, and here they are listed in order of sort of relevance, and in my opinion. So the main reason we assess English learners, particularly in academic content areas, is to ensure that they're included in content instruction in equitable ways. So prior, particularly to the No Child Left Behind Act, English learners were routinely excluded from academic content assessments with the very well-meaning and not illogical thought that these kids are still learning English. It doesn't make sense for us to assess them in a language they haven't learned. The scores may not tell us anything, which is all well and good, but removing them, excluding them from the assessment can have sort of the chilling effect on their education, where it sort of removes any incentive for teachers to then teach those students the same academic content that other students are learning. And it can also lead to situations where if English learners do participate in the assessment and they're not doing as well, if we're not disaggregating their data to look at it, we may not know and see that overall, on average, kids are doing fine when many of the English learners are not doing well. So the requirement in NCLB that we include all English learners in academic content assessment and report their achievement really was sort of an indirect way of trying to incentivize states and districts to include students in the same content instruction that other students are receiving. We also assess them to see if they're ready to exit the English learner subgroup, so to provide information about their English language proficiency. And then we do also want to measure their content knowledge, skills, and abilities, but we have to do that knowing that they are still learning the language in which they're being assessed. And so the fact that they're still learning that language leaves us in a little bit of a pickle in terms of how to interpret test scores. So if an English learner student earns a score of proficient or above on an academic content assessment, it's usually safe to assume that that means the student has in fact mastered the academic content that the assessment was designed to assess. But if they're not proficient, there could be a number of different interpretations, and it's often not clear which is the case. So it could be that they haven't mastered the content that was on the assessment. Could also mean that they haven't been taught the assessment that's on the content that's on the assessment. And it could also just mean that they're still learning English. And so what we're really seeing is that they just couldn't quite access, what the assessment was asking, but they do in fact know what a protagonist is. They just kind of got tripped up with a language that asked about how to identify the protagonist of a text. And this is what creates validity concerns, because as the quotation here suggests, what needs to be valid is the meaning or interpretation of the score, as well as any implications for action that the meaning entails. So we often want to use these assessments to make decisions about, for example, the types of supports a student needs, whether they're ready for certain kinds of instructional environments or opportunities. But if we can't be confident what their score means, then it creates validity issues in terms of how we then use that score. So some best practices to try to improve our chance of having valid interpretations of test scores. I've divided these into kind of two categories. So a couple things we can think about kind of pre-assessment before the kid ever takes the test, and then a couple things we can think about post-assessment once we have that test score in hand. So pre-assessment, the best thing we can do, but which is also sometimes one of the hardest, is try to select or develop assessments that are culturally and linguistically relevant and responsive. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. One is potentially to offer native language assessments. That is allowed under ESSA, and many states do that. It is important to have a caveat there that native language assessments are only useful if students are able to read and write in their native language and have had an opportunity to learn academic content in their native language. So if they aren't used to talking about photosynthesis in their home language, then giving them a science test in their home language may not necessarily help them in terms of their ability to show what they know and can do. That's one thing to think about. Accommodations can certainly help to make assessments more linguistically accessible. As the second bullet suggests, I think it's also important to just try to design tests with some awareness of the item features that differentially affect English learners. So to the extent that we can use or select or develop assessments that need fewer accommodations, as opposed to kind of creating something without thinking about English learners and then using accommodations to make it accessible. You know, the more that we can front load that process, the better. So there has been some research on sort of item features that differentially affect English learners. One of the sources that's cited here, the Noble et al. In particular, is a really great handbook. It's based on several research studies that were funded by IES, where I used to work, where they looked at features of science items and came up with recommendations for how to design science items in ways that ensure or that minimize construct relevant variance for English learners. So simple things like, you know, adding visuals or diagrams for words or concepts that are not central to what's being tested. So, you know, if the item is about a wagon, but the wagon isn't really the point, then put a picture of the wagon so they know what you're talking about. Also just using kind of clear language in item stems and passages, avoiding kind of tricky constructions where you're referring back to a these or those, but it's not clear what these or those is, or using language that's very probabilistic in a way that's unclear. Those kinds of things can help to improve the accessibility of items for English learners and probably also help other students as well. The other thing I just have to say is make sure English learners have the opportunity to actually learn the content on the test. So this goes back to the sort of through line I'm trying to build here of, you know, making sure that English learners have access to the same educational opportunities as all students. So we want to make sure that English learners are also receiving standards aligned content instruction, you know, that if they're in fourth grade, they're learning the fourth grade math standards and ELA standards, not the third grade, or not, you know, 20% of the fourth grade standards, but the rest we're going to have to leave for another time. And anything else that other students have access to, whether it's technology, high quality instructors, classroom materials and resources. So if everyone else has a textbook and the English learners are using, you know, copies or things you printed from the internet, we want to just make sure that they have access to all the same things that other students have. And I recognize that sometimes, you know, not all textbooks have translations or support, but figuring out ways to ensure that they can be made accessible is just so important. So those are the two things you can do. Oh, sorry. And then obviously to tie all that together, the important thing is to provide English learners with appropriate scaffolds during instruction to support their access. So really the job of teachers and educators, which is not easy, I acknowledge, is to make sure that you are providing lots of opportunities for engagement, lots of different on-ramps to make sure that students can get in. So the goal is not to bring the instruction down, it's to bring the students up to wherever it is you're trying to aim your instruction. And a big part of that is providing opportunities for students to use language during class, to engage with peers, and to use whatever assets and resources they have, including their home language and their home culture, to do that. All right, so after you've actually administered the assessment, then what else can we do? We have the scores, we know that the test wasn't perfect, we wish it had, you know, been a little bit more accessible, but it wasn't, and so now we have these scores. What do we do? A big thing I would encourage is to consider content assessment scores alongside English language proficiency scores. So really try to interpret that content achievement in the context of the student's level of ELP. If you have a student who is clearly, based on their ELP score, really just starting out with their English development and they didn't pass the math test, it's more likely that language is playing a role there than if you have a student who is nearly proficient in English and also didn't pass the math test. You're never 100% sure, but it can be really helpful to look at those things together. As I said, remember that low content achievement could indicate a number of different things. So let's try again to collect additional information to help give us more context and more understanding of what those scores may mean. Also try to think about sort of true peers within the EL subgroup. So as we've talked about, not all English learners are the same. So what is a relevant comparison group if you're trying to figure out whether a student is on track or not? So you might think about, again, students who are receiving the same services, how we could compare them to each other, students who have similar levels of English language proficiency, how do they compare? Anything you can do to try to whittle down the group into a more relevant comparison. And then, as I already said, again, trying to bring in whatever data you can to add additional context, particularly for high stakes decisions like course placement or reclassification. For everyday decisions, you don't necessarily have to bring in as much, but the more sort of consequential a decision is, the more information you want to try to bring to bear. All right. And then the last thing I would encourage is, again, try to interpret whatever you see with a focus towards systems thinking rather than student blaming. So, a question I think we're all used to hearing and seeing is, why are the English learner students failing? Why aren't they doing well? Why do we have this achievement gap? Why can't they achieve? And I would encourage us to think about how to reframe that question to say, why is our system not creating conditions in which our English learners are thriving? So why are we not able to get these kids to a place where we know and believe they can get to? So I would encourage us to always kind of bring the question back to, what can we do to help these kids succeed, not why are these kids not succeeding? And I see there's some great things going on in the chat, and I want to invite again, if anyone has thoughts on sort of other kind of student blaming questions that you're used to hearing and thinking about how you might reframe those, love to hear you share that in the chat. So what are some other things that you hear that really just drive you crazy when you hear people talk about them, and how might you reimagine those in a way that's more sort of systemic and proactive? Yeah, I see there's some nice comments here. Helene, I agree that understanding typical test question formats can be really helpful just as sort of context. And certainly, if we're talking about classroom assessment or sort of assessments that teachers are using, you don't always have to use those formats as well. So they're useful for large scale summative assessment, but if there are better ways to get at what kids know, we don't have to limit ourselves to multiple choice tests. In your small group, we're going to encourage you to just kind of reflect on what I've shared here. If you were here for the first webinar, maybe build on the conversations you had there. But again, if you weren't here, that shouldn't affect your ability to participate at all. So based on kind of what's been shared, what's one thing you maybe learned about English learner students and data use that is sort of new or different from how you're used to thinking about them? What's one question you have? What did you learn about the quality of English learner data in your accountability system? So is there anything you heard and you thought, oh yeah, my system is really doing a good job, I know we collect that, or oh, I don't think we have any of these. And so relatedly, what data do you have? What data do you need? Who else needs to be in this conversation? Often English learner data use really requires sort of a round table of folks from different parts of a system. And so really thinking about kind of who the right players are in your system, who would need to be at the table to have this conversation. And then were you to be able to have that conversation, what's one topic from today that you're confident would need more consideration and support in your data system, sort of with that group of stakeholders?
We're having great conversation in our breakout room. So in just a moment, we'll begin doing some share outs so you can hear from other rooms what some of the themes of those conversations and some of the questions that came up in their rooms. It can be, I think, very helpful and enlightening to hear what some of those main topics in the rooms were and compare them to what's going on in our own regions. So I can get things started maybe by sharing a little bit about conversations in our room. One point, we talked more about that issue of mobility, student mobility within the system. and the difficulty sometimes in having the data and the information about the student's previous experiences be easily accessible to the receiving school. The transferability of data with students from school to school within a system or across the state. And related to that, the importance of making sure that data sets, even within a school district, different departments collect different information about the same students, and sometimes that data can be siloed. And the discussion was around the importance of making sure that we have a full, complete picture of a student, and that things aren't being, data sets aren't being kept separate from each other. We talked about the importance of developing a really good system for assessing a student when they first are coming into a school from out of country, having a really good process for assessing that student's educational experience, because the more that we know about a student's background and their level of academic experience can help us make better placement decisions in our schools and better scheduling decisions to support that student, to make sure that we're not placing them in an inappropriate course load. Related to that, we talked about how some schools within a system have a great process set up for that welcoming and intake. They do a lot of contextual learning and understanding, but a neighboring school in the same district might not have the same great processes, and the importance of schools sharing what's working well with their peers, so that as a system, the whole system of schools can get better. So talk about the importance of that. And then lastly, a data point that seems to be often missing in systems is the student voice themselves. Listening to our EL students about their experiences in our system as they go through those EL supports and hearing their perspectives was pointed out as being an important piece of data-driven decision-making, and we need to ensure that we're reaching out to students and gathering their perspective as part of that. So that's a little bit from what was talked about in our room.
Great discussion. That sounds like you guys talked about a lot.
We did. So for facilitators in some of the other rooms, someone would like to volunteer to give a little recap of major themes.
I can go ahead for our room. We were sort of mostly just focused on this same issue around, you know, the test score being, you know, the primary data set that is used for you know, understanding English learner students. We talked a little bit about, you know, what data our state's collecting these days and how our data being analyzed, and, you know, in the ways that had been recommended. So we looked at, we just chatted about a few examples. Hawaii Department of Education being one of them that disaggregate, you know, they had a grant, API data disaggregation grant. And just a few other just a few other districts that are doing that well. I think there was mostly in this conversation just around, like, you know, the opportunity to look at different sources of information and having a mindful approach by leadership about data when they're making higher stakes decisions. And so, you know, we sort of rounded off by talking about leadership being having that mentality around data can do multiple things, and, you know, building capacity and infrastructure to be able to do more than just rely on test scores.
Great points. I agree so much with everything you said.
So I can provide a little bit of some talking points from the third group that split in the middle. So ours was quite a bit around culture, data quality culture, or talking about the aspects of that and the challenges around having confidence in the data, that the quality of the data was affected by spellings of students' names, the mobility issue that we heard, transitions in and out of data systems or even states or countries, and what that might do with those data. conversations around how funding streams affect data points and what that might lead to either as a pro or as a con, and what that might, how that could be used around developing clear definitions, or even with clear definitions, sometimes the application when it comes to data entry is different, and lots of inconsistencies. There were some questions about the effective terminology with so many different terms for similar but different or the same thing, and how that might affect understanding of the data as well. So that was a lot of what we were, kind of the main topics of what we were talking about in that group.
Great, thank you, Christina. Any final thoughts on today's session before we close and adjourn?
I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to engage with you all, and thank you all for engaging. I know we're all a little tired on Zoom, but just appreciate you guys coming out and engaging and having conversation, and wish you all the best in your work, and I really respect what everyone does.
With that, we will draw today's session to a close. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.